Hi, I'm Emily Haynes. I'm a CPA and I'm the founder of Expat Tax Solutions. We're a boutique US tax firm specializing in Americans living in Germany. I started my firm in 2017 and we've been helping Americans file taxes from abroad ever since. The topic of US taxes for Americans living abroad is so complicated and confusing, and there are a ton of misconceptions out there about the requirements and the rules. We're really intending to shine a light into that darkness and hopefully provide some clarity. I think most people really desire to be compliant with the US tax requirements, but the rules, particularly as an American living overseas, are so confusing, it's difficult to feel confident that you're getting it right. My goal with this video and this channel in general is to provide clear and correct information to help you understand those rules and feel more confident. I want to help you sleep better at night knowing you're on top of your US tax situation so you aren't drowning in uncertainty and dread, which I think is a common situation. With that, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. We're just getting started, but I have a long list of topics I hope to cover over time. There's really no end to the confusion that exists on the topic of international US taxes, so I think over time we'll really have an opportunity to answer many questions here. I also really specialize in Americans living in Germany. From a US tax perspective, it doesn't really matter what country you're in. The rules are the same for US filing for everyone outside of the US. So this information is really relevant to anyone outside of the US, but it's especially relevant to people in Germany because I'm likely to use more examples that are a little bit specific to Germany. So I do want to start at the beginning, which is, do you need to file a US tax return? But first, of course, a disclaimer. So while I am a CPA, I am not your CPA. This information I'm providing is general educational and not specific to your situation, and that you shouldn't really rely upon it. If you have a specific question about your specific situation, you really need to be hiring a professional who can look closely at your unique individual situation. So the US is very unique in that it taxes by citizenship instead of residency. Most countries, for example Germany, if you're a German citizen and you move out of Germany and you don't leave any income producing assets in Germany, like a rental property or a business, you would just tell the German tax authorities that you're leaving and then you stop filing tax returns. That is not how it works if you're a US citizen. As a US person, you are taxable on your worldwide income, no matter where in the world you live, and you're required to file a tax return every year in addition to any local country tax return. So if you're a US citizen living in Germany, you probably need to file a German tax return and additionally a US tax return. Now, it's important to know filing a return in both countries doesn't mean that you're paying taxes in both countries. There are a variety of ways to avoid the double taxation, and we'll talk about that in the future. Start with who has to file US taxes. So it's US citizens and a green card holder. So even if you aren't living in the US, as long as you have a green card, you have the same US tax requirements as a citizen. And then other tax residents, so if you spend substantial time in the US, even if you aren't a citizen or a green card holder, you can become taxable on your worldwide income in the US. Right now, I want to focus on Americans living abroad, so we'll talk about that substantial present situation a little bit down the road. So essentially, if you're a US citizen or if you have a green card, you need to be checking your US tax filing requirements every year. And this depends on your filing status and the amount of income you had. So the first step is determining what's known as your filing status. This is essentially your family situation for the purposes of taxes. So whether you're single or married or you have children. And then there are additionally some special rules if you're living outside of the US or married to a non-US person. I want to point out that the filing status for your US tax return is completely independent of the filing status for your German or any other country tax return. So you can file jointly with a spouse in Germany and separately in the US. That's not a problem. These two things don't need to align with each other. I also want to point out that in order for your dependents to count for US tax purposes, they must be US citizens with Social Security numbers. Otherwise, you can't claim them as dependents and they don't affect your filing status. So if you gave birth to a child outside the US, even if they are a US citizen, You still have to go through the whole rigmarole with the Social Security Administration to get them a Social Security number before you can claim them as a dependent for US taxes or use them in determining your filing status. So here's a list we can look at of the filing statuses. These are the ones that will affect most people. So there's single, married filing jointly, married filing separately, and head of household. So single is pretty simple. So it's unmarried, without children, once again without US children, with Social Security numbers. So if you're unmarried and you do have children, and maybe even they're US citizens, if they don't have a Social Security number, you're still going to file as single. Then there's married filing jointly. So generally you can only file jointly if you're married to another US person. So that's a US citizen or a green card holder. And if that's the case, you can file jointly. But what if you're married to a non-US person, which is the case for a lot of Americans living outside the US? So you generally can't file jointly, and you'll file as married filing separately. There is an exception where some people can file jointly with a non-US spouse. It's a bit complicated. It's only worthwhile in limited situations, and it can have a lot of unintended consequences. So you should only be doing that after discussing it with a professional. You really don't want to be going rogue and making that election all on your own without taking a really holistic view of that situation and the goals and the reasons for doing it. The other filing status option, if you're married to a non-US person and you have dependents, you may be able to file as head of household, or if you're not married and you have dependents. So if you're married, to file as head of household, you need to be contributing at least half of the income towards the household budget. Usually you're the higher earner in the marriage, and you also have to have US citizen children or other dependents with Social Security numbers. These rules are a little bit different than if you are married to a US person. There are some additional restrictions on head of household if you're married to a US person. So once you've determined what your filing status is, you can take a look at the income thresholds for 2023 based on filing status. So there's also higher thresholds for each status if you're over 65. So make sure you're looking at the right column here. So if you're not married and you file as a single person, maybe you had a small income, maybe you weren't working for the full year. If your total income for the year is under $13,850, you could be off the hook this year, and you don't need to file a US tax return. And remember, this is US dollars, so you'll need to convert your foreign income to dollars first. The euro amount would be 12,797. So the topic of exchange rates can be a little bit complicated. In most cases, you would use the average rate for the year, which is published by the IRS every year on their website. For 2023 for euros, it's 0.924. If you're married filing jointly, this income limit is the total income for both you and your spouse. And then you see if your filing status is married filing separately, that income threshold is just $5. That is very low. If you had any income at all, even just interest on a tax refund from the German tax authority, that could really push you over that limit. And for everyone, there's an exception to these thresholds, which is when you have self-employment income. So if you're a contractor, if Freiberufler, you have a Gewerbe, or even if you're employed as your main job, but you have some sort of side hustle of self-employment, the threshold for being required to file if you have self-employment income is $400. So that is quite low. So now that you've hopefully determined whether you need to file a return, the next questions are probably when and how. So we'll start with when. So the normal tax deadline in the US is April 15th. That's the date everyone knows, of course. But if you're living outside of the US on April 15th, you get an automatic extension to June 15th. So you don't have to do anything to claim that. It's granted automatically. You can request an extension to October 15th. To do that, you have to file Form 4868 by that June 15th deadline. So there's various sources online where you can electronically do this, or you can print it out and you can mail it to the IRS. If you Google 4868 IRS, the PDF will probably come up as one of the top search results, probably along with some e-file options. So this has to be done by June 15th. And if you live outside of the US and you're mailing things from outside of the US, it has to be received by the IRS on June 15th. So if you mail things from within the US, it's filed when you hand it to the US Postal Service. If you mail things from outside of the US, they either have to be received there by the deadline, or you can pay quite a bit of money to send it by private delivery service. If you live outside of the US, you can also request an additional extension to December 15th. There's not a form for that. You have to draft and mail a letter to the IRS requesting this and explaining why. They have the option to deny it, and this has to be done before your current tax deadline, so before October 15th. Sometimes there's some good reasons for doing that. For example, German rental properties are often very slow to get documents together. You should really just be using that date if you need it. There's instructions on how to do that in an IRS publication, which I'll link in the description. The next question, of course, is how. That's something we'll cover in some future videos, so please subscribe to keep up to date as we post those. And I hope that was helpful and provided some clarity about US taxes from outside of the US.